Okay, good evening, everyone. Just wait for Shanna to reappear and then we can get underway. Excellent, right on cue. Perfect. Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Institute for Northern Studies 2025 to 2026 public seminar series. My name is Dr. Andrew Lind, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. For those joining us for the first time this evening, a particularly warm welcome. And as you might already be aware, tonight's session is being recorded and it will be made available on the INS YouTube channel, where you can find a huge back catalogue of previous papers which we've hosted at the Institute for your watching pleasure at any time you wish. So if you don't want to appear on the recording tonight, please just make sure that your camera and your microphone remain switched off for the duration. And you'll notice that your camera and microphone just now have been disabled, and that's just to avoid any distractions during the paper. But rest assured, in the Q&A, which will follow the paper, I will enable everyone's camera and microphone so you can put your question directly to our speaker. If you prefer to stay anonymous, you can issue your questions via the chat function and I will read them out for you. It's also, I just need to remind everyone that these seminar series are running in conjunction in partnership with the Explorathon initiative, which aims to publicise research at Scottish universities while making it more accessible and strengthening connections within our communities. And if you have a moment later on today, I'm going to post a link in the chat, which will take you to a very short survey, and we would really appreciate you spending a couple of minutes just to fill that out for us. Now, tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, our very own Shanna Bryman. Shanna is a final year PhD student here at INS, who I am reliably informed is on the cusp of submitting her PhD thesis. And having already completed an MLit in Viking Studies with us back in 2021, Shanna caught the bug for research and has been working on her PhD ever since. Her thesis, titled Making Her Story, Evaluating Female Leadership in the Viking Age, provides a fresh analysis of the nature, power and independence of female Viking leaders, applying new methodologies and frameworks to contemporary texts and archaeological evidence. And tonight Shanna is going to be providing us with an overview of her research in her paper, Hidden in Plain Sight, Recovering Female Leadership in the Viking Age. And on that point, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Shanna.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Andrew, and for inviting me to speak. And apologies for the necessary reschedule, but I'm so glad to see that so many of you are able to join us tonight. So let me go ahead and share my slides here real quick. Hopefully this goes smoothly. All right, Andrew, if you could just let me know if that is visible for everyone.
Yep, just going into slideshow mode now, I think.
All right, is that good?
It's just getting there. It's just on your, there you go. Actually.
Perfect. Okay. Right. Well, so this seminar is titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Recovering Female Leadership in the Viking Age. Just a little bit about my research. Women in the Viking Age has been a real up and coming topic recently, so it's kind of been an exciting time to get involved in the research. But as Andrew said, I'm currently on the cusp of submitting my my thesis, so stay tuned for that. But in my thesis, I have examined around 50 examples of women in political, military, and household leadership positions in the Viking Age, which I've dated roughly between 790 and 1100 AD. So my research is inclusive of women from a wide geographic area in the Viking Age, so not just the Viking ones are included in my thesis. I've also, of course, Scandinavian women, but also have Anglo-Saxon England, Kievan Rus, which is modern day Russia and Ukraine, Byzantium, which is modern day Turkey and its surrounding areas, and Francia, which of course is modern day Germany. So tonight's just going to be kind of a small taster of some of this evidence. But I think all of the examples I have for tonight are from Scandinavia. But I will also bring attention to some of the issues that I've come across in my research. And hopefully this will be worth listening to me go on and on about for the next hour. So we'll just kind of jump into it here. So my methodology, I've used modern leadership theory to identify universal characteristics and actions of leaders, which I then apply to known male leaders in medieval written sources. Once those leaders are identified, I return to the original language, either Old Norse or Old English, depending on the source, and I look at the original terminology that was used to describe these characteristics and actions of these male leaders. Then I can apply those to women in the same written sources. So, spoiler alert, many of the English translations don't really do women justice. But additionally, I've created an updated criterion of archaeological evidence from known male burial graves, or sorry, leadership graves, which then can be applied to female burials in the same period. So before we really jump into it, I just want to cover some basic definitions and concepts that I'll be using tonight. First and foremost, leadership. This has been a surprisingly tricky thing to actually identify because it seems like no one really agrees on a definition here. So for my thesis and tonight's purposes, I have defined this as aligning people in a unified direction, having influence and inspiring motivation to make change in an organizational objective. That means an organizational objective. An organization in this case can be anything from a larger political or military campaign to simply making sure your family survives the harsh Scandinavian winter. Sex and gender is another conversation that needs to be had. I'm going to keep this brief. So for archaeological purposes in this talk, when I'm referring to sex, I'm not referring to any sort of gender identification. I'm only referring to the chromosomal identifications of XX for female and XY for male, which is reflected in the DNA. So other combinations of these do exist, Klinefelter syndrome, XXY, or triple X syndrome, which is XXX. But these are really only reflected in about 0.01 to 0.02% of the population. So they're extremely rare, and I've not included them in my talk tonight. Gender, on the other hand, is a social construct. This aligns specific desired traits to a sex, and this has to be accepted by a society as the social norm for that sex. Gender norms vary amongst different cultures, and they change over time. So for instance, high heels were originally designed for men to show off their super buff calves. But these were taken over by women in the 18th century when Marie Antoinette was like, oh, I like those. And men are like, okay, you can have them. Likewise, prior to the mid-20th century, pink was a robust masculine color associated with men, while blue was seen as a demure, dainty color with that was associated with like subtle femininity and women. So these concepts, they change over time. Further discussions on gender identity in archaeology are absolutely necessary. However, my goal here is not to debate any sort of gender identification of any of the individuals that I'm discussing tonight or in my thesis, but rather to discuss their biological sex, the methods with which this is determined, and the impact that that then has on analysis and interpretation of their roles in life. So again, for tonight, I am only referring to biological sex of XX for female, XY for male. Lastly, gender archaeology. This quite simply is just the archaeological study of gender in past societies. Basically, this is a term for using mainstream archaeological procedures and methods, but applying concepts of feminism and queer theory to historical perception. So essentially trying to look at past societies through their eyes with what they regarded as sex and gender. So just a quick note on some of the issues that I've come across in my research. These are, of course, not all of the issues that I've come across of this kind, and written and archaeological interpretations have their own issues. But this is what I'll cover for tonight anyway. So much of my thesis deals with the interpretation of women's actions and roles as they've been portrayed in late 19th century and more recent translations. However, I found that nearly consistently, the actions of women and women themselves are often described with an air of sort of gendered assumption, some examples of which I will present shortly, of course. In terms of gendered realm and space, men are often associated with the outdoor, political, public, powerful positions, while women are associated with more private indoor responsibilities like child rearing and taking care of the house. This has led to some assumptions of gendered responsibilities, and this can even affect conclusions that are made, which basically often relegates women to the sidelines, kind of limiting their positions of power, and kind of promoting men as the more public figures. This, of course, is problematic. There is much more crossover between these two realms, and I don't even like using the indoor-outdoor associations, but it's part of the issues that I've uncovered here. Additionally, these assumed gender roles and gender norms play a significant factor in interpreting archaeological evidence with regard to sex, gender, status, public presence, and when leadership is associated, men are often associated with political leadership, while women are associated with religious leadership, if they're associated with leadership at all. Archaeologically, sexing graves is another issue that I've come across. This happens when you're interpreting sex of an individual based on what the perceived gender of the grave goods buried with the skeletal remains, if the remains themselves are either absent or poorly preserved. There's a lot of crossover between what's deemed male and female artifacts, so this, of course, is problematic as well. We'll get into that a little bit later on. And then an example of just this kind of overall association here can be seen with two different burials, the Oseberg ship burial and the Mindre burial, both burials from Norway. Now, the Oseberg ship burial was of two women who were buried with a myriad of very nice, expensive, elite objects that I've kind of put up here on the screen. It was a ship burial. The two women, we don't know really their association. They were both a bit older. But the burial, regardless of it being a ship burial and having all of this wealth of artifacts, there were also two wooden staves that were buried with the burial. So instead of focusing on all of this other stuff that points to more political aspects, they were basically concluded to be religious specialists. Until more recently, it's been kind of reevaluated, and we now call them the Oseberg Queens, or some of us call them the Oseberg Queens anyway. We don't actually know if one or two, both of them were queens, what their relationship was. This is just sort of interpretation. Now, the opposite of this is true for the man that was buried in Mindre. Now, he was buried with weaponry, so we have a shield boss there and a spearhead. He was also buried with not only a lot of weaponry, but also a gold ring and an iron staff. And we can kind of see the iron staff head here. But instead of focusing on the staff, like what was done for the Oseberg burial, of course, this is interpreted as a warrior grave, which I'm not suggesting otherwise. It absolutely should be. But the association between the grave goods and gender seems to be pretty prevalent here. So instead of this being a religious specialist with weaponry, it's a warrior who is buried with a staff. Okay. So the different types of leadership that I've found in my research that happen in the Viking Age here is political leadership, military leadership, religious leadership, and then we have economic and household leadership. Under political leadership, we have royalty and basically petty royalty, as well as chieftaincy. It's important to point out here, though, that there is quite a bit of overlap in these areas. So political leaders were also often military leaders and had religious responsibilities as well. So for tonight's talk, I've tried to select a mix of these categories to talk about, and I've tried to pick examples that are known, but not too well known, but not super obscure either. So we'll see how I did here shortly. But leadership in the written record. So a large part of my research is looking into how women are portrayed in medieval sources. So today I'm only focusing on Old Norse literature or sagas. I'll also talk about runestones as well. But as I mentioned, my methodology for this has been going back to the original Old Norse sources and examining how men are described in these positions. What words are used, what traits and characteristics are described, then I can apply that to women. Are women portrayed as leaders in Old Norse sources? How are they described, etc. Now, in 1994, Elsa Mundell had written in one of her papers here that the qualities required for a hero in Old Norse society were intelligence, strength, firmness, courage, eagerness to take revenge, generosity towards friends, and so on. He would need these qualities to defend his place in society. And then, interesting, she writes, the qualities required in a heroine in this society are, in fact, the same qualities required in a hero. Now, of course, in Old Norse literature in particular, there's always the added trope of female goading their men to action by using either deprecating words or taking shots at their manhood. So as I've gone through my research, I found that there are a lot of different ways to express various aspects of leadership. So leadership can be described through actions, sometimes action words, sometimes through literal translations of words themselves. But these merely scratch the surface. This is just to give you guys an idea of kind of the things that I'm looking for and what kind of words I'm searching for. So just for comparison's sake, before we jump into the female leaders, I wanted to include a male leader here just as a reference. This example is from Orkneyinga Saga. This is describing St. Magnus, who is an earl in Orkney. I will spare you my Old Norse, but we can see from the English translation just there, it describes Magnus as an earl who was tall and fine. Leaders are often good looking, intelligent, virtuous, successful in war, wise, eloquent or well-spoken, generous, open-handed with money, giving good advice, and what seems to be a very common trait amongst leaders, popular. So these traits or characteristics like these is what I'm looking for when I'm looking at these English translations. Then I can go to the Old Norse. Now, perhaps somewhat predictably, I've also found a pattern in translations describing women. So the wise, fair, intelligent woman motif is a common translation of women's descriptions in the sagas, and sometimes it's the only ones they get. Many of the original English translations stem from kind of Victorian period through the early to mid 20th century. And new translations have been completed, but I still find that there tends to be this sort of kind of perpetuating attitude towards women's descriptions. So I have a couple of examples listed here. The first one describes Eric's wife, Gunhildr. She's mentioned in loads of different sagas, but this one describes her as the fairest of women, intelligent and wide in knowledge, cheerful in speech, and a very deceitful person and the fiercest. Next, we see Sigrid, who's described as the wisest woman and prophetic about many things. Being prophetic is another common trope associated with women, which I cover in my thesis, but I won't cover here. But lastly, we have Thorgerdr. Now, she is being described by action words, stating that soon she proved herself to be a woman of firm character. Now, these are all key phrases that I will look for in the English translations. And I found that after going back to the Old Norse, the terms that are used in these sentences don't necessarily translate this way if the person they describe is a man. However, for a woman, the meaning seems to be made to make sense according to what the perceived gender roles of women at the time were. So just to make it clear, the translations that I've used in the modern translations are really good. The texts are really useful when you're looking at getting the story. But if you're looking for something as specific and nitpicky as I am, some of these words need a careful reevaluation. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about here, that last sentence about Thorgerdr. Now the original Old Norse states, Sinir Thorgerdr thought brat af ser et hon in mesti skoringar. Please excuse my Old Norse. But if translated directly and somewhat without context, the sentence actually reads, soon Thorgerdr appeared to be the greatest leader. Quite literally, the word skoringar can translate to leader or, at the very least, prominent noble person. However, neither of these translations is literally a woman of firm character. So, I also don't see how you can appear to be noble soon. So in this context here, it probably would translate in this regard. Therefore, her firm character seems to just sort of be a gendered inference, which I think is just tied to the gender of the person it's describing. For example, if the person described in this sentence was Thorstein rather than Thorgerdr, I wonder if the translation would still be a man of firm character. Probably not, no. All right, so some examples from the sagas of women. We have Sigrid Stordader here. She is one of the descriptions that I'll talk about tonight. Now, Sigurdr Stordader is an interesting example. She really exemplifies the portrayal of powerful women in saga literature. She's first introduced in Olaf Saga Tryggvasonar, with the title of Queen, Drottning in Old Norse. And through her action, she demonstrates the cunning and intelligence that's frequently attributed to men in the sagas. So let's look at her nickname, Storother, is typically for her translated as the haughty or the imperious, or at best, this might mean the ambitious or the daring. But this right here again reveals this gendered bias in historical interpretation, because the literal translation of Storother can either be great or big ruler or great council. So something that probably would have been celebrated in a male leader becomes a criticism when applied to women. So Sigurður is genuinely an impressive political strategist. She demonstrates her understanding of how friendship networks work in Old Norse society, and she uses this to build her own power base and promote her own political position. So, after her first husband, Eric the Victorious, dies, she maintains this complete control over her own remarriage, strategically seeking the most advantageous match rather than just accepting any sort of arrangement. But ultimately, she decides she wants to marry Olaf Tryggvason. Now, here's where it gets interesting, though, because the conflict that ensues between her and Olaf demonstrates her political understanding here. Olaf gives her a fake gold ring, and then in a later discussion, they're talking about religion. Olaf is Christian, and Sigurður tells him she doesn't mind that. That's totally fine, but she's going to continue practicing the religion of her ancestors. Olaf then gets angry, slaps her in the face, and Sigurður, she doesn't get angry, she gets strategic. So she transforms this personal humiliation into a sort of calculated revenge. So she then marries another guy. She marries King Svein Forkbeard, and she builds a powerful network of friends, which include, of course, her new husband, but also her son, King Olaf the Swede, and Jarl or Earl Eric Hakonarsson. So through persuasive argument, also known as goading, she convinces her husband to take action against Olaf Tryggvason. Now, the saga explicitly states that Svein, her husband, came to fulfill her counsel, marking her as the strategic mastermind behind this revenge campaign. Now, this reference to fulfilling her counsel might also be reflected in her nickname, if we take her nickname to mean Great Council. Again, it doesn't mean haughty, though. So through her story, though, we can see how Viking Age queens understood the dynamic of politics, power dynamics, and alliance building, and of course, the art of transforming personal grievances into broader political movements for personal advantage. All of these skills were reframed as haughty or imperious, yet would probably be considered effective leadership in a man. So I'm now going to turn to the only contemporary Old Norse written source that we have, which is, of course, runestones. Old Norse society was oral in nature, and so we don't really have much documentation other than runestones that come out of Old Norse society themselves. So we can use these, though, to discuss what can be gathered around real women in Old Norse society. So the first one I'm going to start with here, Thyrve, she's kind of in an obvious leadership position. She is a queen, but as we saw with Sigrid, many queens in the Viking Age had to kind of prove themselves to be more than just the mere wife of a king. So Thyrve, for example, was a queen, the wife of King Gorm the Old, the mother of Harald Bluetooth. But what's striking about Thyrve is the individual recognition that she receives on multiple runestones, which actually end up outnumbering the runestones dedicated to the two kings in her immediate family. So she is featured prominently on the Yelling Monument, which is the bottom one on the right just there. Now, this one was commissioned by her son, Harald Bluetooth, and it basically kind of goes on and on about his accomplishments and achievements, but on it, he does pay tribute to his father and his mother. Thyrve, though, is also prominently featured on 3 other runestones, all dedicated solely to her. So there's another one from Yelling, it's DR42. This one was commissioned by her husband, King Gorm, to honor her, his wife. On this one, though, she is described as Danmarker Bot, which is Denmark's salvation. So this is quite a title, and it's likely recognizing her importance to the realm. Now, the 2 other stones give more insight into how Thyrve's followers saw her authority. DR26 in Legborg Song and DR29 in Becca Song were both carved by a man named Tofi. Now, DR26 clearly identifies Therve as queen, drottning in Old Norse. DR29 tells us that Tofi and 2 other rune carvers carved their memorial of Therves over her burial mound. Now, mounds are often associated with high status, or in this case, royalty. But a recent analysis has been done on these carvings, and they've basically determined that the same person carved them. So they're all referring to the same person, Therve, not multiple Therves. So these stones suggest that she wielded considerable political authority as Denmark's salvation, rather than simply just the wife of a king. And according to Saxo, Therve is actually, she actually commissioned the construction of the Danavirke, which is a massive defensive earthwork that protected Denmark from southern invaders. Queens would have been educated and knowledgeable in the running of a kingdom, including some military strategy. Essentially, they would have been able to take over these positions on their own if and when needed. So this military defensive strategy just shows this real strategic knowledge that points to her role in protecting Denmark. Now, when Tofi refers to Therve as his queen and references her burial mound, he's acknowledging not only her authority over her followers within the realm, but he's also literally marking the landscape with her political influence and her power as queen. So I'll move on to Astrid. She was a member of the Jarlabunka family. The Jarlabunka family was a very prominent and well-known family in Uppland in Sweden in the 11th century. And the runestones here surrounding the Jarlabunka women really preserve remarkable life stories of several women in this family. So using the runestones and monastic records and archaeological evidence, I have been able to piece together a narrative of these women who were not merely elite women of their time. They were elite, but they also had to navigate systems that mostly all women in the Viking Age would need to navigate: legal systems, inheritance, mobility. So these runestones really establish the history of a family that ends up sort of producing multiple generations of women who exercised significant household and economic authority. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into all of the women, so I've chosen to go through Astrid, who kind of seems to stand at the center of this network. So I'll start with runestone N68. This was commissioned by her mother, Gunvor. And on the stone, Gunvor describes Astrid as the most skilled maiden in Hordaland. Now, this indicates her elevated status within society. From this and further runestones, it can also be gathered that she's the granddaughter of Thridikr. Her siblings include Ragnfasta, her brother, and Gyridr, her sister. And Astrid's first marriage was to a guy called Eystein. They produced 4 sons: Ingefastur, Eystein, Sven, and Gagr, the last of whom precedes his parents in death and is commemorated on multiple runestones raised by his parents. Following her husband Eystein's death in Jerusalem, Astrid married a second time to a guy called Ingvar. She became stepmother to his son Ragnvaldr, and they bared additional children. We also know that Astrid commissioned several runestones and bridges. That's where we get most of this information. So we also know that she may have traveled on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with her first husband, Eystein. So although Astrid belongs to the elite class, her story really does mirror those experiences that were witnessed by many women, or experienced by many women: childhood, family relationships, marriage, childbirth, and ultimately the profound losses of both a child and a husband. Now, one of the runestones, U136, really stands out amongst the rest of them because this is seemingly a simple formula for remembrance, but it may actually be the story of pilgrimage and adventure. So the stone basically says Astrid raised this stone, or had this stone raised after Eystein, her husband, who died in Jerusalem. After attacking Jerusalem. However, Rune Edberg proposes that there be a reinterpretation based on linguistic and contextual evidence. The term soti there, that says soti Jerusalem, comes from the word sokya, which actually can mean either to attack or to seek out, as in pilgrimage. So this not only leaves room for a completely different interpretation of what he was doing in Jerusalem, but it also leaves room for the possibility that he did not travel to Jerusalem alone. Now, there's possible evidence here from the monastic record, it comes from a book called the Brotherhood Book of the Reichenau Monastery. This is in modern-day southern Germany. And this basically recorded all the names of travelers that were passing through en route to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. And in this list are the names Svein, Estrid, and Austin. So it's been interpreted as Svein and his parents, Astrid and Austin. Now, this suggests that other members of the Jarlabunke family went, not just Eystein. So this includes Astrid. And this is an established pilgrimage route. And it does line up with documented Nordic pilgrimages of the 11th and 12th centuries. And it fits into the Jarlabunke family timeline. In fact, there was also archaeological evidence in the Broby Bridge area that has yielded interesting material evidence. In 1999, Lars Anderson did some excavations and uncovered 3 Christian graves, one of which contained an elderly woman over 60 years of age, with the burial assemblage including 2 coins, a silver ring, 3 weights, stored in a box with a key positioned at her feet. It suggested that this may be the burial of Astrid, or at least somebody like her. Now, archaeologically, the ring and the key may indicate status. I have a lot more on keys in my thesis, but this it could be a status symbol. The coins and the weights would have been essential items for conducting business along these medieval trading routes. So is this the grave of Astrid? Not sure we'll ever know, really, but if not, it seems to be the burial of a woman very similar to that of Astrid in the same region, in the same time frame. So if it's not her, maybe they knew each other. So I'll kind of step down the ladder a little bit here. So we're going to talk about housewives. The word in Old Norse is husfreyja. Now we can learn a lot about this role from runestones like this one. This is the Hasmira runestone. And the role of husfreyja in Old Norse society was not merely this domestic housewife who cooks and cleans and watches the kids. That's perhaps a more Victorian modern idea. But the husfreyja was recognized in Old Norse society as more like a partner in the household survival. She was seen as wielding authority over the farm's daily operations and also supervising any additional household members, such as maybe laborers or enslaved individuals. Now the Husmera stone here, this is from Västmanland in Sweden. It was a commemoration that was raised by a husband to honor his wife, Odindisa. Now this is recognizing her exceptional skills as a housewife. So the stone reads, the good husband, Holmgarter, had the stone raised after Odindisa, his wife. There will never come to Hasmira a better housewife who ruled over the estate. Now this term rada in the inscription is a very significant choice because it's a verb that has multiple meanings. Now this can mean to rule, to govern, care for, manage, have authority, and or simply to lead. Now, much of these are very strongly related to the running or managing of something. So in this case, the farm. In other words, this husband is praising his wife for her exceptional ability as a co-leader of the household. What's also notable here, though, is that we see that this woman is exercising this kind of household leadership during her husband's lifetime, not just after his death. So this really highlights the partnership that would have taken place between men and women in a household when, at the end of the day, the goal is really just family survival. So these strict gender-based divisions of labor would potentially have been harmful for the family's well-being. So there was much more crossover. We do also see some potential other aspects of household leadership responsibility here. Odindisa's name in particular is raised a lot of interesting questions about religious practices on the farmstead. So her given name is likely Disa, but the added prefix of Odin referring to the god Odin maybe suggests that she was a religious leader on the state as well. But if we consider this, we maybe even get a clearer idea of what responsibilities household leadership entitled. Okay, let's move on to archaeology. Now, artifacts found in burial contexts are referred to as grave goods, just in case anyone's not familiar. But these can tell us a myriad of things about individuals that they're buried with. Sometimes this can be ambiguous, especially when skeletal remains have deteriorated completely or maybe are inconclusively sexed. But this is probably one of the most important forms of primary source that we have. Now, that's not to say that the written record isn't equally as important, but rather that the two complement each other. Because archaeology is really this real, tangible connection that we have to the past, and written evidence helps us make sense of what it is that we're seeing in the archaeological record. So, for example, grave goods can tell us maybe the status of an individual, possibly the sex, maybe the gender. They give us an idea of education level, if they're higher status likely, but they can also indicate profession. So for example, chieftain, warrior, trader, merchant, but also lifestyle. There's combs that have been found, personal grooming items, needle cases and textile implements may indicate a skill or craftsmanship like smithing tools. But sometimes grave goods can be a little confusing or challenging to interpret because there might be gestures that are symbolic. For example, children buried with weapons that are much too big for them. Warriors found with broken or bent swords. And to confuse things further, there was also a practice called mortuary theater. Now, this is when objects and the deceased were moved around at times during what could be months of a funeral procession. So all of these factors make it slightly more challenging to interpret some of the archaeological record, because when archaeologists look at a burial, they're really seeing when all of these things stopped moving and maybe not necessarily their original positions. But of course, it's still the most tangible and arguably the coolest connection we have to the past. Now, using archaeological material to determine the sex of the deceased can be tricky and problematic at times. So what I've done here is kind of compiled a very non-exhaustive list of commonly gendered grave goods, which have been used in the past to identify the sex of an individual when osteological or DNA analysis can't be performed. For example, let's say cremations or poor skeletal preservation. The items in green are objects that have been found in both male and female graves, so they're not necessarily reliable for sex determination. However, based on various finds and reinterpretations, I believe the chart looks a little more something like this, which muddles things a bit. Now, it's important to point out that just because weapons or gaming pieces have been found in female graves, it doesn't make this a typically, or it doesn't negate that this is a typically male find. Everything must be taken into context. So for example, staffs are usually something that are found in female graves, but as we saw with Mindersunde, they have appeared in male graves as well, although that's a bit rare. So while swords don't make a man, men are more frequently buried with them. So all of this just needs to be taken into consideration here, but I'll show you in the next few slides how this can be quite unfortunate and lead to some unfortunate misunderstandings. So my aim in looking at the next few burials here is, number one, to demonstrate that leadership is identifiable in the archaeological record. Also to show that archaeological sexing of graves is problematic at times. And third, to demonstrate how accepting some of these perceived gender norms can hinder our understanding of women's capabilities when it comes to interpretations in the archaeological record. But first, which of all of these is leadership worthy? Now, a large part of what I've attempted to do in my thesis is to create an updated archaeological criteria which demonstrates leadership status. So there are some key markers that I've listed out here. These are not all of them, but of course, when these things are present in burials, all of this needs to be taken into context. So context really does matter. So just having one or two of these things doesn't necessarily lead to leadership, but it also shouldn't be discounted either, which is why context is important. So is it a ship burial? Is it a mound? Is it a simple inhumation with one lone finger ring? So all of this needs to be taken into consideration. So to start with, everyone's favorite warrior. Now this is, of course, Birkegrave 581. This is a 10th century burial. It was excavated by Hilmar Stolpe in 1878, and it was thought to be the quintessential Viking warrior grave until it was determined through DNA analysis that she is in fact female. Now, she was buried with 2 shields, a sword, an axe, a spear, a fighting knife, 25 armor-piercing arrows, 28 gaming pieces, including a king piece, that's important, a gaming board, 3 dice, 2 horses, equestrian equipment, a fragment of a silver dirham, an iron ring pin, and it was likely that she was dressed in a reflective coat, so she would have been seen at a distance. But there was also embroidered silk and a silver-trimmed silk cap with silver tassels. Say that 3 times fast. All right. This person is clearly associated with warriorship given the amount of weaponry that was in the burial. The grave does check many of the markers necessary for the distinction of military leadership. First and foremost, the extensive amount of weaponry. The sword itself, though, is interesting because it appears to have been made for a smaller hand. Even when I examined this at the History Museum in Stockholm, it almost looked like my hand wouldn't fit. So it was definitely made for a smaller hand. It looks like it was made for her. The gaming pieces, and specifically the king piece, might have significance, and the gaming board itself, but there's a common misconception about the game Nefertapel, the Viking chess game, that it was played by lots of Vikings. In reality, or in historical context, I should say that it's mostly reserved for either the elite or for military strategists. So it's a game to practice military strategy. So these being found in burials often indicates a higher position within the military. So it's actually very particular. The horses and the equipment, the equestrian equipment that were found in the grave, specifically the stirrups in particular, the textiles and reflective coat, all of these to me, point to some sort of visible leadership. She would have been seen from afar. So to me, this is the grave of a military leader. However, after the revelation of her sex back in 2017, there was perhaps an unsurprising bit of pushback from some scholars, whether or not she could have been a warrior simply because of her sex. One of the arguments was that her bones didn't have any visible injuries on them. I'm not going to spend too much time on this anyway, but it is interesting to note how much pushback occurred only after the announcement of her sex as female. And it wasn't really ever questioned whether she was a warrior when the grave was thought to be male. So just interesting, I think. This has, of course, raised other important questions. What makes a warrior? What is military leadership? These are valid questions, and in my opinion, they should be asked, and they should be asked about both sexes. So not just to justify the existence of a female warrior. Another female warrior / potential military leader is this one found at Anvil in Nord-Trøndelag. This is in Norway, in which an osteologically sexed 20-year-old woman was laid to rest on a bed of textiles and down feathers with a scabbard, a sword, a sickle, 8 gaming pieces, a quartzite stone, possibly a king piece, a whetstone, a spearhead, iron fragments, and a dog. Now, Leszek Gardella has noted that the possibility that the numerous iron nails that were found in the burial could mean that she was buried in a boat, which of course would elevate the burial as well. So was she a military leader? Like BJ581, she definitely checks many boxes. Her age at death is quite young, however, but it's also possible maybe she was a military leader at a young age due to her status, or maybe this was her first command and it went very badly. It could have maybe been symbolic of what she could have been, so it's difficult to say. But BJ581, she was only 30 at the time of her death, which is still relatively young to our standards. Yet she was very likely a military leader. So, and just to point out historically, men have held positions as military commanders at very young ages, and this is not often contradicted. Right. The next one here, we have another female burial. This one was found at Nordre This is also in Norway, in which the body of a woman was laid to rest with a sword, an axe, a shield boss, 5 arrows, a lance head, a whetstone, and equestrian equipment. So here's a nice reconstruction for you guys. Now, Lesha Gadella has also suggested the position of the sword in this burial from her waist up to her head could be significant. It could be reminiscent of the way that swords are depicted in positions of power on the Bayeux tapestry, which is here. So we have several different slides there. So maybe this was her family's way, whoever buried her, their way of making her status known in the end. Not sure, but even though she was buried with lots of weaponry and equestrian equipment, I'm not prepared to say that this woman was definitely a military leader, but maybe if there were more remaining higher status objects like textiles, that analysis could change, but I would be remiss if I didn't classify her as a potential warrior. So all of this to say that despite the pushback against 581 being a female warrior and more likely military commander, she was not alone, nor was she alone in the written sources. Specifically, there was a Byzantine author's account of the Battle of Dorostopol in 971 between the Byzantines and the Rus Vikings, in which the Byzantine victors made remarks about the number of dead women on the battlefield. But the remarks that they were making sounded more like they were shocked at the number of dead women rather than that there were dead women. There's also an Irish source, the Coda Gadil Regala. This is the War with the Irish and the Foreigners, which details accounts of a 10th century attack on Munster. But in the list of commanders, the very last one is the fleet of the Ingen Ruid, or the Red Girl. So suffice to say, the evidence is there. So we'll move away from military here. This is the Scarboat burial. This is found on the Isle of Sanday in Orkney. This one dates to the late 9th to early 10th century. But this burial has been examined before, so this is one that might be recognized, same as 581. But it is worth revisiting here because it does, it gives examples of household and economic leadership. Now, this burial contained 3 people. In the center of the boat was an elderly woman around 70 years of age with a child about 10 years old. But there was also a third individual, a man in his 20s or 30s, who was positioned up near the stern, and he was laid on his side in a sort of crouched position. Now, the grave goods can tell us quite a bit. The man, he was buried with a sword, a shield, a bow, arrows, gaming pieces, and 2 weights. The woman's assemblage was included an animal-headed whalebone plaque, which is pictured there on the left, a gilded equal-armed brooch, a comb, a weaving baton, sickles and shears, 2 spindle whorls, and some needles in a needle case. There were no objects specifically associated with the child, but it is worth noting that the child was in a position of the boat that was later eroded by the sea. So it's possible that there were additional artifacts that have been lost, unfortunately. But the prominence of the woman's position and the child in the center of the boat demonstrate that either one or the other or both were the likely intended receivers of this burial. The man, he was obviously higher status as well, likely military leadership, just owing to the gaming pieces and the weaponry, and the fact that he was buried in a boat. But the woman really does seem to be the center figure here. So who was she? Was she a chieftain, an elite household leader? She likely engaged in textile production. We know that from the textile tools, but did she have women under her that she supervised? It's just a really interesting burial here, specifically the whalebone plaque. This is particularly noteworthy here. Now, Olwen Owen, she has suggested that this might actually have religious significance as to smooth your linens on. We do only know about 6 or so of these and other burials with similar plaques. They're all with women, higher status women. So it's definitely an interesting find here. So while I would love to go through the mountains of archaeological evidence for female leadership, I am sadly limited by time here, so I will make this my last example. This is the 10th century burial at Klinta in Öland in Sweden. This burial demonstrates that mortuary theater that I talked about earlier. Now, this was an elaborate burial. It started with a joint cremation of a man and a woman who were carefully laid out on bear skins and burned together on a ship on land. Following this cremation, the remains were then deliberately separated, and there was a complex burial process where grave goods were separated and each had their own mound constructed above them. So these actions demonstrate a complex process that would require significant planning and resources and a lot of community participation. So the mortuary theater here does parallel other examples that we know of. For example, the Oseberg ship burial was open for months. We know this from botanical evidence. There were seeds from various seasons indicating that the burial had been left open for quite some time. We also have the 10th century account from Ibn Fadlan, the Arabic traveler who witnessed the Rus Viking chieftain's burial. And this was a big procession as well. It included the moving of the chieftain's body and the ritual sacrifice of a slave girl. So these extended elite burial processes seem to be reserved for the elite, but very interesting and persistent through Viking Age burial practice. But back to Clinta here, this deliberate separation of the cremated remains at Clinta, followed by these individual burials and breakdown of assemblage of grave goods indicates that while the cremation might have been joint and might have connected the pair in life, the separation of their burials also recognized their individual identities and potentially even different spheres of authority. So the man, he was buried with several items, including a sword and gaming pieces and gaming boards, scales, about 200 ship rivets, all of this, of course, suggesting military, possibly political leadership as well. The woman, she was placed in a ceramic urn in a pit, and this was subsequently filled with just lots of extraordinary assemblages of grave goods, so including about 151 beads. There was also a bearded battle axe that was driven vertically into the shaft. There was the presence of a key and an iron ring with about 4 Thor's hammers. There was also 2 copper sheets with runic inscriptions, and then over 300 ship rivets. So all of this points to elite power in Viking Age Scandinavia. But the main showpiece of this assemblage was, of course, an iron staff. Now, this was lavishly decorated. You can see that there in the picture. It had a handle, and it was also decorated with a 3D image of a hall on the top of the staff there. Now, this is particularly telling because halls functioned as centers for political power. This is where leaders exercised their authority, held assemblies, demonstrated their ability to care for and provide hospitality for their followers. In fact, in the Swedish History Museum, the label for this is the Furstenin of Öland, which means maybe chieftainess or even possibly princess of Öland. But of course, because of the staff, the general interpretation here has been that this woman was a vulva or a sorceress rather than a political leader. Now, the religious interpretation is supported by the staff and the Thor's hammer. However, the interpretation that she is only a vulva just kind of further exemplifies this gender bias when looking at female authority versus male authority. So we can see this reflected in the terms Godi and Gila. Now, the word Godi is typically translated to chieftain and priest, but Gidya is only priestess, but Gidya is the feminine equivalent of the same word. So the fact that it's only referred to as priestess rather than chieftain and priestess is also very telling. So this discrepancy definitely raises questions about maybe potential modern gender biases kind of having influences in translations and interpretations of this burial evidence. But like a Godi, a Gida may have exercised religious and political leadership functions, similar to male Godi, who would have combined these priestly duties and political authority and have legal responsibilities and engage in military leadership. So the Clinta woman's grave assemblage includes clear markers for political authority, the hall on her staff, especially, the battle axe, the extensive maritime connection with the ship rivets, the key, and just the sheer scale invested in her burial. But altogether, Her burial certainly parallels assemblages that we see with male political leaders without question. Yet, for some reason, this is a question with the Clinton women here. All right, so I will quickly leave you with some final thoughts here. So while the Viking Age was patriarchal in nature, women were indeed present and not excluded from holding leadership positions in their homes and communities. Modern and perpetuating Victorian interpretations of gender norms and status continues to be problematic when it's applied to Old Norse culture and realms of responsibility. Gender archaeology continues to be necessary to strive for a more accurate interpretation of leadership, roles in Old Norse society, and we must continue to address any assumed associations of power based solely on the perceived gender of grave goods when archaeologically sexing. Instead, we should be interpreting the evidence regardless of gender. So what does the evidence say? So by re-examining linguistic evidence alongside contemporary documentation and archaeological findings, I believe we can develop a clearer understanding of how women maneuvered through these networks of family ties, legal systems, and social rank in the Viking Age.
Super. Thank you very much, Shanna. I thought it was excellent. I'm sure there's going to be lots and lots of questions, and hands are already shooting up. Oh, maybe it was applause. I'll give people and yourself a wee minute to catch up, and I will, if the buttons work, make sure that everybody can unmute and put their questions directly to Shanna. Sophie, I will get you in just shortly. I've just got to remember how to unmute people. I was too busy listening to what you were saying, Shanna, and I should have had this up and running. Oh, what saying is it? Oh gosh, why can't I do this? Participants 3 dots. I've only done this 100 million times. There we go. Thank you, whoever put that information on. Right, sorry. Here we go. Okay, folks, we're off and running. Yeah, so if you want to pop your questions directly to Shanna, you pop your hand up and I'll invite you to unmute. Or you can pop your questions in the chat and I can read them out, whatever is easiest for everyone. Lots of lovely comments in the chat. Okay, Sophie. Well, while people are furiously typing or formatting questions for you, Shanna, you mentioned the keys, and I know that obviously you talk a lot about this in your thesis, but maybe I was just wondering, how does this fit into the evidence that you're building here that there is a bias going on, because keys are one of these objects that do have these kind of gender connotations, and how do they compare to the other objects that you mentioned this evening?
Yeah, so keys have, in the past, they've sort of been associated with the husfreyja, and it's been thought that if there's a key, this must have been a housewife. But the reality is that they're not very common. They're not as common as that would make us think. And they have been found in male burials and even in child burial. So it's a bit of this piece of ambiguous evidence, because maybe it doesn't necessarily reflect a housewife, but it might reflect a higher status or maybe the control of something. So typically it was thought that the key would control the food stores, which is something that the husfreyja would do. So maybe it's something to do with, it's likely something to do with status, with higher status, but definitive housewife, I'm not sure that that's the correct connotation there. So I think because they are more rare than originally thought, it probably has more to do with status and less to do with an association with Hustreus.
Okay, right, okay. And is it similar with things like scales? Because I know the scales are another one of these quite gendered
Yeah, it's
items.
interesting. That one is interesting because when the scales and weights are found in male burials, the assumption is this is a trader, this is a
Sure,
merchant.
yeah, yeah.
But when they're found in female burials, the assumption sometimes becomes this is the wife of a chieftain or a merchant, when really it should probably be this is a merchant. So it's kind of fighting through this, pushing women to the sidelines.
Mhm.
And what does the evidence say?
Yeah, perfect, okay. Sophie, come on in.
Hello. So I'll keep it simple. In summer, I'm working in Eriksstaðir in Iceland, in the Living History Museum and archaeological site. And of course, in Erikssaga, there is also this. There are two very prominent women, which are Guðríður and Auður. And I wanted to know, because I was a bit late, unfortunately, to your talk. Did you mention these ladies, or do you have anything on them already?
I didn't mention them, so you haven't missed that.
That's good.
But
I'm
I
glad.
believe in my, and that's really cool, by the way, what you're doing this summer. Um, I do mention Freydis in my thesis,
Yeah.
but merely in a way of her kind of taking control of a situation, uh, which is
I
an
mean,
unfortunate situation.
well, yeah, it depends on the source you take, because I mean, Freydis in one is the villain, and in the other one the heroine. So
Exactly.
we're a bit
Yeah,
doubtful about her, but obviously with the situation of the sites and the ruins that we have, and the bit of handfast evidence in archaeology, um, it's mainly Auður and Guðríður that we really think are much more meaningful.
I would tend to agree. I don't have anything on those two in my thesis. I had to stop at some point. I'm still finding things, and my supervisors are like, no, no more.
All right,
Um,
and then
but yeah, I do find them very interesting, and I think that they, in terms of female mobility, I think it's very important. But I haven't really done too much on them in particular,
yeah,
unfortunately.
because I thought, like we assume that Auður, at least in Dublin, when she was married to Olaf the White, was also basically was the leader of Dublin, and used Olaf as the poster boy. Um,
Yes.
which I think is a brilliant idea, because it makes so much sense. So the sagas do tell us that she had the financial authority in Dublin,
I
which
would,
probably also gave her the power to actually then flee the country and build the ships and all that. So
yeah,
yes,
I would consider her, in my opinion, I would consider her a chieftain.
yeah,
Just based on how she makes her way to Iceland. She throws her high pillars overboard. She takes the land, she distributes it to everyone else, and she marries her grandchildren off. And I would think that these are all responsibilities of a
yeah.
chieftain.
And she frees her slaves and gives them land. So it's
Yeah,
like
and giving them
it's
land
mind
and
blowing.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And then I just wanted to quickly thank you for the idea of the Velva staff being a symbol of authority as well, because I've been thinking the same thing, and I'm really glad to see somebody else taking that idea of the whole building on the Glinda stave, to be a symbol of power rather than magic.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Super, thank you, Sophie. We've got a question in the chat which I'll jump to, and it's from Tracy, just to ask, in general, are historical archaeological conclusions being reviewed in regard to gender and sex biases? That's a big question, Shannon. I don't know if you want to.
Sorry, could you repeat that? I was trying to look for it here.
Yeah, sure. In general, are historical archaeological conclusions being reviewed due to gender and sex biases?
Yes, I would say. There have been several that have been reviewed by loads of scholars, and I'm joining them in some of this reevaluation, but I would say yes, in general.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, Ollie, do you want to come in? You had your hand up.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, come on in.
Fantastic. Well, I had a quick question, but I realized that the extent of the question could be difficult to answer. But in terms of archaeological finds, both in the north, the south, the east, and the west, would you say that there is a more concentration of powerful women or women's graves in the southern areas, or would you where would you say the larger concentrations of powerful women are?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer it fully, but there have been a number in Sweden and Valskarda that are powerful women's graves. There's also been, I mean, there's several from Birka, but I wouldn't say that the majority of those are female. But yeah, I think that it's an interesting question. I'm not sure it can be answered by me just now. But yeah, there are quite a few burials in Valskarda in Sweden that is the majority are female high status graves. So maybe in that graveyard.
Thank you very much.
Superb. Extra research, new projects coming up.
My postdoc.
Exactly. Yeah. We've got a question from Anthony in the audience on the chat. When considering aspects of economic leadership, I would imagine that the raising of rune stones was not cheap business. Could you say something shortly about how economic leadership comes into your research?
Yes. So it wasn't. It wasn't easy. It definitely required economic built access to funds and that that ability to raise stones. And the fact that they have raised so many stones really does tell you about the level of their economic standing within the society. So economic leadership in my research, I've tried to sort of flesh out I do talk about elite, but I wanted to kind of bring in more of your kind of average person. So there's a couple of mentions. There's one mention from, it's, I believe, Orkneyinga Saga owner, who is a tavern owner. And she's just briefly mentioned in this flitting passage of John and so were drinking at Unn's tavern. She owns the tavern. And that's all the mention she gets. But you have this woman who is a proprietor and owning this business and managing its finances and its resources and taking care of its people. And that, I think, is certainly economic leadership. There's also aspects of travel and, as we mentioned earlier with Andrew's question, the weights and scales. So when those are present. But yeah, I've tried to kind of bring out some of that, but there's also a lot of textiles. So there's a couple of graves that I won't get into now, but that have extensive amounts of textile equipment, which couldn't necessarily be all used by one person. So this I've kind of interpreted as maybe they were in charge of multiple people who full-time engaged in textile production. This all had to be overseen by somebody. So we have a woman who's going to be doing this because this is their area of expertise. So they are in this position of economic leadership, overseeing and supervising multiple women, especially in urban centers. So I've brought that kind of into it a bit as well. And then there is a difference between the farmstead economics and the town economics. So in the town, you do have people working full time, and that means that they're not at home taking care of their house and resources. So someone has to be doing that as well. So were they getting those things from other areas like a modern town, or where was this responsibility going? So there's lots of these sorts of questions that I've sort of brought into it. But there's also examples in sagas. There's one example in Jarl Saga where Hallgerdr goes to buy cheese from Bergthora, who's Njal's wife, and Bergthora doesn't sell her the cheese. So Hallgerdr basically sends a slave to steal the cheese. And it's a funny episode, but what this is showing is that there was trade and economic exchange taking place on the farmstead, and women were responsible for these. They could say who they would sell to and who they wouldn't sell to, and this could even affect that household's survival if they're not going to sell to them. So even though these funny episodes, we still get a lot of information about how economics worked on the farmstead through it. So hopefully that answers.
Super. We've got a question in the chat, but we've got Stephen in the audience who had his hand up for a minute. So come on in, Stephen.
Ooh, right. Well, I think hopefully my camera's come on there. Where we go.
We can hear you anyway, Stephen.
That was great, Shannon.
There you go.
Good. That was great, Shannon. Thanks for that. Was brilliant, really comprehensive kind of study you're doing there, which is great. And I was particularly fascinated by the sort of way words are translated to downplay the power of a woman, and in a way that wouldn't happen if it was translated with a man. And a couple of things I was actually. Another one to lob into the female leaders. You might I don't know if you've done much on a PhD. I'm always fascinated by Frau Kirk in Orkneyinga saga, who, although she's kind of falls into those sort of villainous, manipulative women trope from sagas, she's clearly a real power broker, and also appears to be probably governing Caithness and Sutherland at one point. It would appear in the 12th century. But anyway, that was just lob that one in. I was going to ask a question that's sort of nothing to do with anything in a sense, but I was fascinated by the Odin Disa couch on the stone, and you said that probably her given name was Disa, and the Odin. How would we know that in a sense, that the given name was Disa and that Odin wasn't part of her name?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. That is not, I will say that's not my idea. I believe that had come from other women being named Disa and then having the sort of Odin tacked on to other names as well. But it's just an interesting thing to think about, because we tend to think of Freya as if you were going to worship someone as a woman, but that's not really the case. That was not on me. I can actually, if you're interested, I can send you some of the scholarship on that one. Yeah,
that'd be interesting, because although this is a different topic completely, I'm always fascinated by the way that Thor's name for both men and women repeatedly crops up as a personal name, and far more than any other god, as far as I can. And that's the first time I'd actually ever come across Odin being associated with the name. So that's partly why I was asking about that. I'm always fascinated by the prevalence of Thor and the relative absence of all the other gods in personal names, but that's a different subject entirely. But anyway, but that was great. But that was brilliant. Thanks so much for that. It was great.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you're interested too, Stefan Brink does work on some of the cults in different areas. So you see different names popping up for different cults in different areas. So that might be interesting as well. Like Frey.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And different place names, isn't it? Like some place names in some areas.
Place names that have to do with different gods. Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting.
Great. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you, Stephen. Excellent. A question in the chat from Rebecca, and she's typing this because her kids are in bed and she doesn't want to wake them, which is very sensible. But one female figure of leadership qualities that always comes to my mind is the deep-minded, who fled Scotland/England, married her kids off in Orkney, and then, of course, funded a successful settlement in Iceland. What are your thoughts on that, Shanna?
Yes. She's the one that threw her pillars overboard and claimed that land in Breiðafjörður. She's such a cool figure. I definitely consider her a chieftain for sure. And she even receives a ship burial. She dies sitting upright in bed at her grandson's wedding feast, which then turns into the wedding feast / funeral feast. She's a very powerful person. I think she's a very interesting one. I didn't put her in here just because she's more well known, and I wanted to kind of try to bring in other ones that maybe not so much, but she's a favorite of mine. I also like Laxdala Saga. It's a good one.
Superb. Any other questions, folks? I think Shanna's done a very good job at fending everyone off and answering all the questions in a lot of depth. Is Alison sneaking in there? Nope. She's just saying thank you very much. There's lots of very lovely comments in the chat, Shanna. I recommend you have a wee scroll through them.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any more, we can let Shanna off the hook, and I'll just ask everyone to join me in the traditional awkward online round of applause and just say thank you very much, Shanna.
Well, thank you guys for coming. I was excited to see so many people show up. So that's awesome.
We'll need to have you back as well. Of course, you've got this
Yeah,
new
anytime.
postdoc in the line, so we'll hear about that in a few years' time. And before I let everyone else away to enjoy the rest of their evenings, it's just to say that that is it for 2025 from the INS seminar series, but fear not, we will be back in 2026, and we're going to be kicking things off on the 26th of February with another paper from another of our very talented PhD researchers, Tara Athanasiou, who's going to be speaking on a related topic, placing women, tracing journeys, female mobility and social bonds in the Norse period. So make sure that you sign up to that. And in the meantime, from everyone at INS, we hope that you have a very restful, festive break, and that we will see you all again in 2026. But bye for now, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.